In 1939, F. Scott Fitzgerald was suffering from ill health and struggling to make a living as a screenwriter in Hollywood. While his early novels, This Side of Paradise and The Beautiful and Damned, had skyrocketed him to fame during the splendid years of the Jazz Age, that fame was short-lived. It's hard to believe now, but The Great Gatsby, published in 1925, was a commercial flop, selling only 20,000 copies. His novel Tender as the Night, published in 1934, sold even fewer, a mere 12,000 copies. Yet, despite these disappointments, Fitzgerald didn't abandon his writing. He had an idea for a new story that he believed could become the greatest novel he'd ever written and restore him to his former place as one of America's most renowned writers. But there was one problem. His failing health meant he couldn't work on it alone. So that spring, he contacted an employment agency to help him find a secretary. And that's how 22-year-old Frances Krall, newly arrived in Los Angeles, came to get a behind-the-scenes peek at how Fitzgerald wrote a novel. Many years later, under the name Frances Krall Ring, Krall wrote a memoir, Against the Current, As I Remember F. Scott Fitzgerald. She shared her experience working with Fitzgerald during the last 20 months of his life on the book he hoped would be his magnum opus. I discovered this memoir this past year and found it to be a fascinating glimpse into the mind of this famous writer. By analyzing Krall's anecdotes about working with Fitzgerald, I was able to reconstruct his writing process. Best of all, this led me to uncover invaluable lessons that I believe can help any writer, whether you're just starting out or are looking to refine your craft. So, did Fitzgerald succeed in finishing this book before he died? Did it end up eclipsing the storytelling of The Great Gatsby? Keep watching to find out and get a peek into Fitzgerald's writing process. Chapter 1. Collect Your Ideas. Fitzgerald's new story idea was for a novel about the film industry in Hollywood. He decided that his main character would be a Hollywood studio manager. However, he hadn't fleshed out the rest of the story, so he got to work collecting ideas in his notebooks. Krall wrote in her memoir, "He tried to write something every day, notes for a chapter, for a character. He had to feel he was working. With a knife-sharpened, blunt-edged pencil, he determinedly put words on paper, some meaningful, some not." I love that Krall points out that not every note Fitzgerald scribbled down was profound. These notebooks were a place where he could plant ideas of all kinds. Only time would tell which of these seeds would later grow into something he could use in his story. Fitzgerald wasn't the only famous writer to keep a notebook. W. Somerset Maugham, Mark Twain, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Joan Didion, and John Steinbeck are among the famous writers who kept a notebook to collect ideas and help them out of creative ruts. In Maugham's book, A Writer's Notebook, he observed how keeping a notebook forced him to clarify his thoughts. He wrote, "By making a note of something that strikes you, you separate it from the incessant stream of impressions that crowd across the mental eye, and perhaps fix it in your memory. All of us have had good ideas or vivid sensations that we thought would one day come in useful, but which, because we were too lazy to write them down, have entirely escaped us. When you know you are going to make a note of something, you look at it more attentively than you otherwise would, and in the process of doing so, the words are borne in upon you that will give it its private place in reality." You might think of this first step as if you were an artist collecting objects for a still life. An interesting bottle here, an old book there, a bouquet of roses, a basket of fruit. Anything that captures the eye and sparks your inspiration. So too, you can fill your notebooks with fragments of ideas, lines of dialogue, character descriptions, lists of names, outlines for possible scenes. Chapter 2. The Treatment. Once you've ruminated over the ideas in your notebooks and the story has percolated in your subconscious for a while, what comes next? When Fitzgerald reached this point, he wrote a treatment. Kroll doesn't describe what the treatment was like, but it was probably similar to a film treatment. This is usually a summary describing the major scenes of a film. Filmmakers use this to pitch the project to film studios and producers before the first draft is written. If your collected ideas are like the objects an artist gathers for a still life, then the treatment is like the moment you begin arranging them on the table. You're not painting yet, but you're experimenting. You can determine which objects look best grouped together, which ones should be in the foreground, which in the background, and which ones you should leave off the table completely. As a writer, this is the stage where you start sorting all of the ideas scattered across your notebooks. Your story begins to take shape as you describe the overall trajectory of the plot and major scenes. Whatever you write down isn't set in stone, but it's a way for you to get an idea of how you want the story to unfold. You'll also be able to identify what still needs clarity or further research. Fitzgerald's treatment bore the tentative title Star, the name of his protagonist. He sent the treatment out to the editor of Collier's magazine, hoping that the magazine would advance him money and serialize the story. However, the editor sent back a rejection, calling the treatment cryptic. Fitzgerald had planned to write the story whether or not the editor accepted it, but the rejection still stung. It meant that the editor did not believe Fitzgerald knew where he was going with the story. But Fitzgerald needed money and couldn't spend all of his time in a story that he couldn't sell. It might have remained only in rough notes if it hadn't been for his longtime friend and editor, Maxwell Perkins. Fitzgerald had also sent him an outline, and hearing of the rejection, Kroll wrote that Perkins was afraid it would be a blow to Fitzgerald's morale. He encouraged Fitzgerald to write the novel, praising the original approach to a story about Hollywood. He loaned Fitzgerald $250 and promised an additional $1,000 at the beginning of the next year. Perkins's belief in Fitzgerald was just what the author needed to really get down to work. Now he was ready for step number 3, fleshing out any of those ideas that had seemed cryptic and finalizing his plot. Chapter 3: Plotting and Planning. Kroll wrote, "He became the feisty boxer who clenched his fist. He would show them. He would win this one." As though starting a rigid exercise program, he made charts of segments of the book and planned how long each segment would be. He divided the segments into episodes and the episodes into chapters. Assorted jottings and anecdotes were assigned to specific areas. Stray bits of description fell into place. He wrote character profiles so that he knew who his people were. Writers have long debated whether it is best to methodically plot out a novel before the first draft, or whether you should discover the story as you write. I believe this really comes down to the preference of the writer and also the scope and complexity of your story. Fitzgerald obviously preferred the former approach with this novel. He worked patiently with scientific precision as if he were an explorer about to make a long voyage, planning his route, stocking his provisions, and making sure he would be fully equipped for any adventure. In fact, his plotting sounds much more rigorous than many of the plotting guides you'll find online or in books today. He wasn't just jotting down a few lines for each scene on sticky notes to arrange on a plot board. Kroll explains that he spent at most 3 or 4 hours a day at his writing, spilling out sometimes 12 pages. Kroll would type out copies and then retype based on Fitzgerald's corrections. She remarked on how objectively Fitzgerald treated his work, writing, "There were constant alterations in plot sequences. From his notebooks he drew pet phrases, names, ideas. Like the parts of a jigsaw puzzle, he placed and replaced them until they fit. He knew where he was going, what he would keep, and what he might toss out later." Matthew J. Broccoli, a Fitzgerald scholar, shared excerpts from these episodes in a posthumously published edition of the novel under the title The Love of the Last Tycoon. I highly recommend this edition if you're interested in reading the novel. For example, Here is an excerpt from one of Fitzgerald's notes. "It is important that I begin this chapter with a delicate transition, because I am not going to describe the fall of the plane, but simply give a last picture of Star as the plane takes off. The plane, therefore, has left for New York, and when the reader turns to Chapter 10, I must be sure that he isn't confused by the sudden change in scene and situation. Tell how the snow hid the wreck, and that in spite of searching parties, the plane was considered lost, and that will resume the narrative. Begin the following story, that a group of children are starting off on a hike, that there is an early spring thaw in this mountain state. The atmosphere must be an all-cold climate, where the winter breaks very suddenly with almost a violence. This scene must be subtly done, and not look too much like a parable or moral lesson. Still, the impression must be conveyed, but be careful to convey it once, and rub it in." Whether you are a meticulous plotter like Fitzgerald, or you enjoy diving right into your first draft, Fitzgerald's approach reminds us of the importance of always bringing care and patience to our work, as well as a willingness to experiment and ruthlessly edit until the best version of our story emerges. Returning to our metaphor of the still life painter, this is the stage where we would begin our quick sketches. We're not ready yet to begin painting, but the sketches help us to finalize the arrangement of the objects on the table, to determine the best viewpoint, and envision what the final painting will look like. For this step, as a writer, you might want to explore different approaches to plotting until you discover the one that works best for you. Maybe you also find it helpful to break down every scene as Fitzgerald did and flesh them out on paper, with notes to yourself about what you want to include in each scene. Or perhaps you start with your characters, writing in-depth character profiles, making sure you know your protagonist and antagonist, as well as Fitzgerald knew his, what motivates them, what they truly desire. The most important thing is to push your story beyond the limits of overused tropes and cliched ideas into something original, something powerful that only you can tell. The goal is to craft a story that will truly resonate with your readers and stay with them long after they've finished reading the last line. Chapter 4. Testing Ideas. As Fitzgerald's story took shape, he relied more and more on Kroll's input. Kroll wrote that Fitzgerald would ask her to read a page out loud so he could hear how it sounded. The cadence of the words was as important to him as the arrangement of the words on paper. Reading your work out loud is a wonderful way to get a new perspective on it. For one of my recent stories, I had a text-to-speech computer program read my work to me, and I found it very helpful for identifying awkward phrasings or too long sentences. However, I did not yet feel that the story was ready to be shared with another person until I had completed the first draft. So, of course, this raises another question that writers have long debated. How early in your writing process should you share your work? Fitzgerald clearly trusted Kroll and relied on her to help him test his ideas. He would describe his characters to Kroll to see her reaction. She wrote, "It was exhilarating to hear Scott talk about his characters with such intensity, to see how well he knew them. He would watch for a response. I didn't have to say much. If I raised an eyebrow or nodded my head, he wanted to know why. He never dismissed a reaction, nor did he need constant affirmation. He made you feel your input was important. These were stimulating hours, lessons for me in building a story, tearing it down, redoing it." Perhaps you are able to find a trusted friend like Fitzgerald did, with whom you feel comfortable sharing your early work. Maybe you don't share everything you've written so far, but are just able to bounce ideas off them and get their feedback. Sometimes, if I'm struggling to figure out a direction in my plot, I will discuss it with a fellow writer friend who can bring a fresh perspective. Chapter 5. Writing the First Draft. When Fitzgerald felt he had finished all of his preparations and it was urgent for him to begin writing the story from start to finish, he dove into step 5. Kroll wrote, "We established a routine. He turned out pages every day and I typed, first in triple-space drafts, giving him ample room for making corrections, then retyping in doublespace, and then, likely as not, another retyping for the possible first draft. We stayed on course toward a solid first draft of Tycoon. He had made almost half a dozen starts, and after each interruption, he rethought and reworried and rewrote. Unfortunately, however, tragedy struck. Fitzgerald died suddenly of a heart attack at only 44 years old on December 21st, 1940, 4 days before Christmas. Fitzgerald's last book remained unfinished, and it might have remained unpublished as well if it hadn't been for the work of Maxwell Perkins. Kroll also provided helpful feedback as Perkins and the editor Edmund Wilson worked to put together an edition of the novel. They decided to publish it, along with many of Fitzgerald's notes, in a volume that would include The Great Gatsby and a collection of Fitzgerald's best stories. In a letter, Perkins wrote of the unfinished manuscript, which was to be published under the title The Last Tycoon. The first chapter alone is good enough to stand by itself. It breaks a man's heart to see what this book could have been. The book was published in November 1941, almost a year after Fitzgerald's death. The writer who had almost faded into obscurity was now greeted with critical acclaim. In the Saturday Review of Literature, Stephen Vincent Benet wrote of The Last Tycoon, "It shows the full powers of its author at their height and at their best." Fitzgerald's most important writing lesson. While The Last Tycoon did not become a bestseller, it did spark a new interest in Fitzgerald's work. In the 8 years that followed, Kroll writes that this newfound interest spiraled beyond expectation. Critics debated Fitzgerald's place in American literature. His once out-of-print work returned to bookstores, and during World War II, the Council of Books on Wartime and the Red Cross distributed over 123,000 copies of The Great Gatsby to soldiers overseas. By 1960, over 100,000 copies of The Great Gatsby were being sold a year, and now the book has come to be considered one of the greatest American novels ever written. But all of that might never have happened if Fitzgerald had listened to those who were critical of his work, if he had abandoned The Last Tycoon in its earliest form. Writing can be discouraging. Rejections pile up, readers leave scathing reviews, self-doubt sabotages our work. In the face of these obstacles, many authors give up and stop writing. But not Fitzgerald. He was filled with zeal for his creative work right up until the end, passionate about writing a story that he believed only he could tell. Although he didn't manage to finish the novel, he poured his heart and soul into every stage of the process. And this is one of the most important writing lessons we can learn from Fitzgerald. In a letter Fitzgerald wrote to a young aspiring writer in 1938, published in a 1995 collection, A Life in Letters, he revealed the true secret to how he became a great writer. You've got to sell your heart, your strongest reactions, not the little minor things that only touch you lightly, the little experiences that you might tell at dinner. The amateur, seeing how the professional, having learned all that he'll ever learn about writing, can take a trivial thing, make it witty and charming. The amateur thinks he or she can do the same. But the amateur can only realize his ability to transfer his emotions to another person by some such desperate and radical expedient as tearing your first tragic love story out of your heart and putting it on pages for people to see. That, anyhow, is the price of admission. It is one of those professions that wants the works. You wouldn't be interested in a soldier who was only a little brave. Thank you so much for watching. If this video inspired you, please help it reach more writers by giving it a like. You can also subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one, and also to my email newsletter where I share more writing resources, essays, and inspiration. God bless, and I wish you all the best with your writing projects.